After being told by Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen that inflation is transitory, the inflation monster is on a rampage.
Welcome to Riches Revealed, revealing how to improve your finances and lead a richer life. Coming to you from scruffy little city of Knoxville, Tennessee, is certified financial planner Jack Martin.
In the US in 1950, $1 could buy you 4 gallons of gas. That's 4 gallons of gas for $1, not $4 for 1 gallon of gas. It could buy you 4 books, so that's 25 cents a piece. Now I think they want about $25 a piece. Could buy you 2 movie tickets. It could buy you a ticket to the Major League Baseball All-Star Game. I think that last one might be the most surprising of all. So some of this is due to inflation. Some of it might be cultural changes, but I would describe the most of it to the inflation. So what is inflation? So I think you know that it is a rise in prices of goods and services over time. But what is it that causes the rise in prices? So the most important thing that I want you to take from this show today, if anything, is to understand that the rise in prices over time, inflation, is caused by an imbalance in supply and demand. So a little bit of that is not a bad thing. And the government actually, the Federal Reserve actually has a target of a 2% inflation rate. The reason for that is because it keeps the economy running smoothly, it keeps the factories humming, keeps the warehouses from backing up. You want to have a little bit more demand than you do supply. That's the fundamental reason that prices rise over time, is you have just a little bit more demand than you do supply. Keeps the economy running smoothly. Everybody is fairly happy. It does make big price changes over time, true, but it keeps the economy running smoothly. So the government likes to have a little bit of inflation pressure. So what are the measures of inflation? So measures of inflation are, the most common one you're going to hear on the news is going to be what's called the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And CPI is a basket of goods, the components of which I'm going to give you right now. So components of that basket of goods that goes into the CPI are housing 40%, transportation 22%, food 15%, medical care 7%, education 6%, 10% on recreation, apparel, and other goods, the remainder of that. So a couple other numbers you might hear occasionally are core inflation, that excludes food and energy, pretty big things to exclude right now, and PPI, Producer Price Index. Producer Price Index is a little bit more of a leading indicator, whereas CPI is definitely going to be a lagging indicator. So PPI is the numbers that producers of goods are seeing in the pipeline. So that can be a little bit more of a leading indicator for us. And unfortunately, those are not looking very good right now either. So that leads me to, where do we stand right now? So on Friday, June 10th of 2022, the government had been expecting inflation to continue to moderate. But instead, we got an annual rate that was announced that hit 8.6%.
Oh my gosh!
A 40-year high.
Oh my gosh!
Yes. So parts of that went into that were energy was up 34.6%, groceries up 11.9%, which was the biggest rise since 1979. Shelter 5.5%, inflation highest in the South at 9.2%, and Midwest at 8.8%. Core prices, you remember you mentioning that core inflation number, which excludes food and energy, was up 6%. And that was down slightly from the April number. So what was the highest rate that we've ever seen here in the United States? I'm going to give you a little quiz on that. The highest number in the United States in the living memory of just about everybody here is 14.6% in 1980. So let's hope we're not headed to that, because if we are, that was a society changer here in the United States. So just so you know, if we went a little bit back further in history, we saw apparently 20.5% in 1917. So that would be the World War I era, and 29% during the Revolutionary War era. Take those numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt, because there's different reasons to be a little suspect of any numbers that are older. The government does have ways of changing the way it measures things over time, for instance. But those are estimates, and that gives you an idea, a historical perspective on things as well. So Americans are scared. The Consumer Sentiment Index from the University of Michigan, which is pretty closely followed by people in the economics field, fell to a number of 50.2 from 58.4. That was a month earlier, and that is the lowest on record since it began in the 1940s. So people are really scared. The Wall Street Journal, in a June 10th editorial, said, quote, "Energy and food prices made up much of the May increase, but this is cold comfort for consumers. Americans used to be able to substitute lower-cost protein when beef prices rose, but everything in the supermarket has become more expensive in the past year. Eggs, 32%, chicken, 16%, milk, 16%, even soup, 14%. Lower-wage workers are getting crushed by Bidenomics." And it goes on to say, "A historically tight labor market has pushed up nominal wages, but worker pay isn't keeping up with prices. Real average hourly wages have fallen 3% over the last year, with 2/3 of that decline in the last 4 months." So what they're saying there, just so you know, when they talk about real average hourly wages, is they're saying that compared to the cost of living, even if you're getting an increase, it is still a net negative after you consider the cost of living compared to your wage increases. So that does lead me to one point, which is that I don't want you to necessarily believe, or at the very least be skeptical of what politicians and the people hired by politicians are saying. There's a few different reasons for that. Number one is they don't want you to panic. And there's a few reasons for that as well. One, they want to get reelected, those who are running for office. Two, the psychology of inflation is very significant in that you can get into a feedback loop in which inflation kind of feeds upon itself. As people become more concerned that prices are going to rise, what do? What would you do when you get your checks? If you know that something's going to cost you more in a week, what do? You go out and you buy it right away. Well, that just feeds into the inflation. Remember, that's creating more demand. You might have put it off for even a year or two, let's say, but instead you go and you buy it now. So that creates more of that demand that helps to fuel inflation. So they're trying to avoid having you do that. And the other reason is that there's a real dark secret that I'm going to let you in on here now, which is that many politicians, and in fact, I could say all politicians, kind of have a conflict of interest in this regard. They actually like inflation. And one of the reasons is because of the fact that the tax revenues brought in by the government increase during inflationary periods, because inflation is generally based upon a percentage of a nominal number, let's say your wages. Well, let's say you do get a decent size increase in your wages. You may or may not be keeping up with inflation, but because taxes are based on that number, they get more revenue into the government. And the other thing to understand is something that we're going to be getting into, which is that one of the groups that makes out very well during an inflationary period is a debtor. If they've got debt that is based on a fixed rather than a variable number. So I'm going to give you another quiz here. Who is the world's largest debtor? Yeah, it's your Uncle Sam. So the U.S. government is the world's largest debtor by far. Now, much of that is to our own people, but bear in mind, debtors make out very well, typically in inflationary periods, and so there is that conflict of interest. So I will always want you to be skeptical of, like I said, politicians and anybody hired by the politicians, and that includes over the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. So what are the reasons that we're seeing inflation? Many reasons, actually. And on the news, they tend to want to simplify things for political reasons, but I'm going to give you a host of reasons and kind of what I think the balances are. Certainly the war in Ukraine and Russia affecting commodity prices. Russia's one of the biggest oil producers, Ukraine one of the biggest grain producers, along with other commodities as well. So that certainly affects things. The supply chain issues that we're having. We still are being affected by COVID lockdowns in China. We're seeing the reluctance of people to go back to work. The Great Resignation, you may have heard about that. People seem to be very reluctant to go back to work like they were previously. Now, some of that may be financial. During the COVID lockdowns, people's saving rates jumped enormously, and for quite a while, they had that to fall back upon. Didn't feel like they needed to go back to work right away. Some of it may be cultural. They've decided that maybe there is more to life than, working as much as they were. So that's an issue. One of the things that I think is important to understand is that we are seeing inflation rates elevated across the entire world at this point, not just in the United States. Domestically here in the news, the politicians on the left want to be able to say that it's just a global issue, thereby abdicating any responsibility for what has happened. Politicians on the right want to say that it's just a domestic issue, and thereby be able to blame the current administration for the inflation issues. I will say that if you look at the numbers prior to the COVID pandemic, the United States was on the lower third of the inflation rates for developed countries worldwide, and now we are very close to the top of the world for inflation rates amongst the developed world. So that does lend credibility to the idea that some of the things that have been done domestically have contributed to the inflation crisis that we're currently in. And some of that may be due, in fact, to the amount of stimulus that the United States enacted. For the size of our country per GDP, that's gross domestic product, the United States was right near the top of the world for stimulus. So let me give you an idea of the numbers. In January of 2020, so that would be right around the time of COVID starting, the money supply as measured by what's called M2 was 15.4 trillion. 2 years later, January of 2022, it was 21.6 trillion, an increase of 40%. So that goes to one of the reasons that you can get an increase in demand is that you have more money floating around in the economy. When you have more money chasing the same number or less number of goods, prices tend to rise. The other thing that may be contributing to inflation is one that I've mentioned to you a few minutes ago, which was expectations. So the psychology that goes into inflation is that you become concerned when you see prices rising, and that feeds upon itself and causes you to go out and buy goods more quickly. And it may get to the point where you start hoarding goods because you buy things in the expectation that they're going to be higher in price in the future. Therefore, you try and stock up on them. Let me give you a few examples of just how bad this can get, too. So in 1922 to 23, the Weimar Republic in Germany, after the defeat in World War I, Germany was saddled with debt and reparations and was having trouble being able to pay that back. They also had reduced production capabilities, and they started producing large amounts of currency. And at one point, inflation reached 29,500% per month. Workers were paid with suitcases filled with money, but the suitcase itself might be worth more than its contents. Hungary, 1945 to 46, another post-war issue. Post-war Hungary, after World War II, dealt with supply shocks and production infrastructure issues, and was saddled with reparation payments to the Soviets. And the government continued to print money, and at one point there was a 100 quintillion Pango note. I don't even know how much a quintillion is, and I hope I have no reason to ever find out. At the peak of hyperinflation there, prices doubled every 15 hours. Venezuela, a more recent example, they've continued to have inflationary rate issues and struggle with food shortages and blackouts. An example that might be closer to home would be America in the 1970s and early 80s. It reached 14.6% in 1980 and basically changed the culture in America to the point where there was no longer an option for most people to have a single earner household. The two-income household rose during that time period. In 1960, dual-income households were only 25% of the households, and now it's 60+%. So very much a restructuring of society, and we wouldn't necessarily call that hyperinflation. We would just call that high inflation, but anybody who lived through it knew how painful it was. So who's going to benefit and who is going to be hurt from this? So as I said, there are some groups that benefit from this. Number one would be the government. They benefit from the high interest rates due to the increased tax revenues that they're going to be receiving. Debtors who have fixed rates on their debt will benefit because their debts will basically be inflated away. Let me give you an extreme example here. So let's say we have runaway inflation and inflation reaches thousands of percent and you decide to pay off your mortgage. You've got $300,000 remaining on your mortgage and you can sell lemonade for $100,000 a cup. Remember the examples that I was giving you before. This is not I'm giving you an extreme example, but it's not an impossible example either. So you go down the street, set up your lemonade stand, sell a few cups of lemonade, and for $300,000 and walk into the bank and pay off your mortgage with the equivalent of 3 cups of lemonade. So there are people who are going to benefit from this. Other groups that are going to benefit are those who hold physical assets, such as real estate, who are involved in producing of raw materials, such as commodities and oil. So those are a few examples of people who will benefit. Who will be hurt? Probably people like you. So your wage increases, for instance, are not likely to keep up. Let's say inflation, we already know it's running at 8.6%. What are the chances that your boss is going to give you an 8.6% raise this year? For most of you, very little. Most bosses are conditioned to giving 3% raises each year, and the chances that you're going to get an 8.6% are not very high at all. Other people who are going to be hurt are credit card debtors, people who are going to have variable rates, and those rates are going to increase as the federal government, in response to the inflation, starts raising interest rates. Anybody who's got a variable rate mortgage, for instance, another big one that you could be hurt on very badly. So anybody who's got a variable rate note of any sort that you're paying on, you're going to wind up being hurt by that. So what to expect in the near future on this? I would say that one thing to bear in mind is that consumers may be finally fighting back on this. So there were some earnings misses in May from Walmart and Target and Abercrombie, and it may have indicated that consumers have reached their pain limit. And this is really a step that's needed to rectify this problem. So let me kind of walk you through what the steps are to fixing this from that perspective. Until the consumer, the final end buyer, is willing to say, no, I'm not going to pay that, everybody along in the supply chain is going to continue to pass along price increases. So what happens when the consumer says finally, no, I'm not going to pay that? Well, Walmart and Target and Abercrombie turn to their suppliers and they say, no, we're not going to pay that. The supplier turns around to the manufacturer and they say, no, we're not going to pay that. The manufacturer then turns around to the producer of the raw materials and says, no, we're not going to pay that. So it's going to take a while to move back up the food chain, the supply chain, but it's a necessary step. And it's going to take a while, but It's good news that we are actually seeing some sort of pushback from the consumer level. It's very possible that we could be looking at a recession. Now, the federal government and the Federal Reserve, Treasury are trying to make it a soft landing, but what they're telling you is not necessarily what's going to happen. We already know, we've already seen that they are either wrong or misleading us. So one group of people to look at would be people who are knowledgeable but not directly affiliated with the current administration, such as Larry Summers. So Larry Summers was a Treasury Secretary under Clinton and Director of Economic Council under Barack Obama. He said, "I think there's certainly a risk of recession in the next year," Summers said on CNN, and I'm quoting here. "I think given where we've gotten to, it's more likely than not that we'll have a recession in the next 2 years." Continuing on here with the quote, Summers has been outspoken in warning that President Joe Biden's economic policies are damaging the country. In March 2021, Summers blasted Biden's $1.9 trillion America Rescue Plan as the least responsible macroeconomic policy we've had in the last 40 years, and warned that it would set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation, unquote. Additionally, nearly 7 out of 10 economists believe there will be a recession in the United States in the next year. This is according to the Financial Times, amid geopolitical tensions and soaring inflation. Well, Janet Yellen, of course, is telling us a different story. She said recently, "There's nothing to suggest that there's a recession in the works," she said during an interview at the New York Times Economic Forum. Powell said in March, "In my view, the probability of a recession within next year is not particularly elevated," he said during his post-meeting press conference. That was in March. In May, he told a different story. He said, "The question whether or not we can execute a soft landing or not, it may actually depend on factors that we don't control." All right, so I'm going to give you my perspective on this. So the Federal Reserve is going to tighten the money supply and raise interest rates. We know that. Equity markets are pricing that in. We're likely to see an economic slowdown. That's kind of the goal, or a soft landing to be able to control the inflationary pressures. Part of the issue, though, is the Federal Reserve has been behind the curve on this issue from the start, and it's more likely to be painful than it would have been if they'd been more ahead of the curve on this. So what do you need to do here at this point? I would say delay paying off debt that you may have that's at a low to moderate fixed income rate. That's probably something you're not going to hear too often from any other advisors, but if the issue comes down to paying off that or paying off a variable rate, you want to be paying off debt that's at a variable rate because that rate's going to be going up. Do pay off the floating rate and go to your employer and explain to them the situation about the inflation, but don't get your hopes up too much on that. They're conditioned, as I told you, to provide a 3% raise. They don't want to hear about an 8.5% raise, particularly when their costs for supplies are going up. You've got to be willing to change jobs. The psychology is different. So an employer who's, let's say he's paying $40,000 a year and he's having trouble bringing people in at that $40,000 rate. What's a 10% increase on that? Another $4,000. There's something different about the psychology on this, and they're willing to raise that. They're willing to pay $44,000 to bring people in, but they're not willing to give their current employees that same kind of raise. Just bear in mind that's the psychology. I think you'll find that on your own, but you've got to be willing to change jobs if needed to be able to handle the situation. Review your investments with your advisor. I would say you're looking for investments that are going to benefit from inflation. So some ideas on that would be physical assets, such as real estate. Now, that doesn't mean you have to actually go out and buy a house. You could also use things like real estate investment trusts, what are also called REITs. Companies with pricing power, such as monopolies, commodity producers. You could actually invest in some of the stocks of companies that produce some of the things like metals, oils, where they've got the ultimate pricing power. You want to take a look at things like gold. You're going to want to take a look at things like bonds that are specifically tied to inflation rates, and that would be examples like TIPS and I bonds. Like I said, I'll probably have an episode coming up about that. There are significant drawbacks to those, so we're going to need to take a look at those as well. And I have a bonus segment for those of you who stuck around to the end. It is called the Rule of 72. It is particularly applicable to what we're talking about today with inflation. So Rule of 72 is a rule of thumb, and you divide the interest or the inflation number into 72 to find out how long it is going to take for the money to double or be cut in half. So right now we're running at roughly, we're going to round up to 9% inflation. We put that into 72 and we come up with the number 8. So what that's telling us is that it's going to take 8 years before your buying power is cut in half. If you were receiving 9% interest on your bank account, it would be 8 years for your money to double. So another way to look at it too is what we've seen in the last 40 years or so has been in the ballpark of 3% inflation, and people almost ignore it. But bear in mind, let's do that same formula. 3 into 72, you come up with 24. So ask yourself, are you making double what you were 24 years ago? Hopefully your career has been on the correct trajectory and you've gotten better jobs as it is. But if you haven't, has your job doubled your salary where you're at? So that's the rule of 72, real useful. And I want you to keep that and bear that in mind so that things like inflation don't sneak up on you. Even during times when we're looking at relatively low inflation, it's still something that you need to be aware of. But I think that basically covers it for today. If you have some questions, you can go to richesrevealed.com. There you will also be able to see all my notes on this, all the links to my research articles. This whole podcast was extensively researched, and you may benefit, if you're curious, from being able to see those links and read some of those articles that I read as well. And you can also leave me a question or a note there on that website, richesrevealed.com, as well as leaving me an audiogram where you can actually have your questions read on the air. So till next time, be one of the good ones.
The end.